What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Mass Effect 2. Obviously, the second title in the main Mass Effect trilogy. We are playing the Legendary Edition, but I had not played this game previously, as it was just a major chunk of gaming that had passed me by. And it was finally time to rectify that. I also review games after 100% all the time, pretty regular thing for the channel. If you're new to the channel, that does include achievements, however, it does include a lot more. If you're not subscribed and you click on my channel, first thing you'll see is a video explaining the whole thing and everything I cover. From there, Mass Effect 2 is, of course, the second entry of the Mass Effect series. However, I would tell you that the second game does seem to change focus in a pretty significant way. So whereas the first game attempted to be somewhat of a more traditional RPG, Mass Effect 2 definitely leans much farther into the realm of a third-person action game. Now, the story for this one is actually pretty interesting. So you can either import a character or start a fresh character in Mass Effect 2. Now, if you start a fresh character, you have the option of using the Genesis interactive comic at the start of the game, which will allow you to pick major choices that you did in the previous title. Or you can, of course, just straight up import your character. Now, I did multiple runs through the game, as you might imagine. As I'm going through the trilogy, I am doing 2 full runs for each game at a minimum to see both Male Shepard and Fem Shep, as well as the Paragon and Renegade side of things. But in terms of the plot setup for specifically Mass Effect 2, the required story is actually pretty short. Like, if you were just to run through the required missions, it's a pretty short game. However, the game itself is really structured around building a team, which comes down to a lot of companions. Now, the game starts with Shepard and the Normandy actually getting blown to bits. You get resurrected with the Lazarus Project from a human, basically terrorist organization known as Cerberus. Cerberus did make an appearance in the first game through a series of side missions, and while they were definitely up to no good in Mass Effect 1, so you can have heard about them up to this point, is my point, they brought you back from the dead, which took 2 years. So 2 years after you get blown to bits at the start of the game, you are resurrected, and you can actually use this opportunity to customize your new Shepard, and this includes if you imported your save, which I thought was a nice touch. That's a nice narrative way of being like, hey, if you want to pick a new class or just change your looks, but also keep your decisions from the previous game, here's an option. Beyond that, Cerberus has us looking into a bunch of entire human colonies just disappearing, and through this, we learn of a species called the Collectors, who are apparently working on the side of the Reapers, who we will have learned of in the first game. Now, we have to stop the Collectors. And as far as the story goes, that's pretty much all I'm going to say here. I will be doing a separate video after I do the reviews where I talk about just all the story in the series in general in a bit more depth. But for this video, we're not going to spoil it too much outside of the fact that we need to go stop the Collectors, and we do this by gathering companions, etc. Now, broad thoughts on the story is that the companions are really well done, and they kind of have to be with how integral they are to the main story. However, it is a little more than that. Your choices with the companions and how you choose to treat them and whether or not you earn their loyalty, as the game calls it, directly impacts the final mission, in addition to upgrades you did or did not make to the Normandy throughout the game. So while the title itself does kind of wind up lighter on the RPG mechanics, the main plot feels very much so an RPG because you're making a lot of choices. If you played the previous title, you get to see the choices you made in Mass Effect 1 kind of play out and some of their consequences in Mass Effect 2, but also with all the choices you're making in Mass Effect 2, then culminating in that final mission, which plays out one of many different ways depending on the decisions you make in that mission and leading up to that mission. It really felt like you were making a lot of impactful choices, even if the RPG mechanics were pretty light. Now, in terms of character creation, as I mentioned, you can import or start a new character, of course, but the main thing I want to talk about with character creation is the classes. All of them saw new abilities and became more distinct. My primary playthrough was with a Vanguard who got the charge ability, which definitely changed up how that class played significantly, but every class kind of got something new, while at the same time seeing some of their more superfluous stuff reined in. For instance, rather than things like hacking or electronics being part of the class kits, they were stripped out and now just like everyone can do those blanketly, which kind of makes sense because you were basically just having companions do whatever you couldn't do in the first game, so I don't think it made a huge impact to the gameplay in that regard, but it's worth noting. Now, I will say in terms of character progression, this is where the game gutted quite a bit of the RPG mechanics. So as you level up, you basically still put things into these little skill bars that will then increase what that ability does in some way, but they vastly reduced the amount of things you can put skill points into, so there's just less options here in general. But again, a lot of those options from the previous game weren't that impactful anyway, so I can see why they made the decision to do that. However, this is something that also extends to things like armor and equipment. Now you have a bit of a loadout. There's really only a handful of weapons that are available to you, so each subtype of weapon might have like 2 or 3 variants, with there usually being a very clear best option. And then with armor, this is where things are a little bit more varied, but still it's more about your appearance than it is actual stats. So you can customize your basic set of armor like completely. You can buy parts that will then affect your overall stats here, but this is primarily a cosmetic thing. In fact, some of the DLCs baked in with the Legendary Edition give you access to full sets of armor that just give you like set bonuses. But overall, the options here are drastically reduced from the first game, which had like 10 tiers of all sorts of armors, etc. to choose from, whereas in Mass Effect 2, it's a very simple system with a very clear progression. Now, let's talk gameplay and world building. So the entire game has a bit more of a mission-oriented structure, especially in comparison to Mass Effect 1, which felt more like exploration of the universe and you landing on planets and checking things out, even if they were mostly empty. There was some exploration to it. Well, a lot of that has been removed with Mass Effect 2, and things again have more of a mission structure. Now, you will get access to another Normandy that was rebuilt by Cerberus, and you will actually drive it around star systems, going to planets. However, rather than explore those planets, you'll often be using a mini-game where you shoot probes at planets for resources. Now, these resources can eventually be used to upgrade the Normandy or your combat progression. In fact, a lot of your extra damage upgrades and shield upgrades and health upgrades, they come from research on your ship. So you'll be probing planets, gathering all these resources, and then spending them on research when you get access to it, which is pretty early in the game. However, sometimes when you're doing this mini-game on each planet, you'll detect an anomaly. This will open up a mission of some sort, and rather than explore the planet, you get dropped straight into the mission area. And as a result, that means there's very little exploration and everything kind of just jumps right to the action. Overall, I think this makes for a much tighter experience because there's not just a lot of empty, pointless wandering. And given that I just played Mass Effect 1 recently, I can see why this decision was made, because most of the exploration in Mass Effect 1 didn't really have a purpose. Now, on a personal note, rather than this approach, I would have preferred them just have made the exploration meaningful, but that's just a personal preference. But what we're left with here is a game that really feels more like an action movie at times than anything like an RPG. You're just kind of rushing in. It's very combat heavy, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's like these big combat arenas that are kind of everywhere. And the basic gist of the game is you receive a report or someone needs help or you detect an anomaly. You jump in right to the mission area. You fight a bunch of bad guys, usually in a combat arena. You have a couple conversations here and there where you make some choices, Paragon, Renegade, all that. And then the mission wraps up. That's the general gameplay loop here. And as a result, again, the main thing that got cut was the exploration. There are a couple of areas in the galaxy where you can dock, such as the Citadel or Omega or Tachanka, where you can go and kind of explore a small hub area. And you'll find shops here, but there's not that much stuff to buy in general, outside of just more potential research for you. So again, the gameplay and the world building really just reflects a clear shift towards an action game and away from an attempt to be a more traditional RPG. I would tell you what remains in place is the spot-on world building. Regardless of how you feel about RPGs or what gameplay mechanics you prefer, I think the one thing that has impressed me the most about Mass Effect as a series so far is that the world building is really well done. This particular game introduced a bunch of new alien races, some of which work in close tandem with other species and things we've already met, and despite really not doing that much exploration, the world still manages to feel alive and like there's a purpose to everything that is going on. And that's something the game does very well. From there, let's talk about Paragon and Renegade. So this functionally works a bit different than Mass Effect 1. In Mass Effect 1, you would get Paragon or Renegade points, and this would unlock the ability to put points into a skill, Charm or Intimidate. And then using the skill, Charm or Intimidate, would unlock your Paragon and Renegade options. Whereas in Mass Effect 2, it's just your Paragon or Renegade points. So you either have enough Paragon or Renegade to pass the check, or you don't. There is no skill associated like Charm or Intimidate, so something to keep in mind there. Another actually pretty cool addition, and kind of backs up the whole action movie thing, is the Paragon and Renegade interrupt. So sometimes as you're watching cutscenes, you might see an interrupt flash up on screen, either Paragon or Renegade, and then you can click the associated button and your character will interrupt the scene. You can choose not to engage with this, but this was a pretty cool addition that kind of makes you feel like a more active participant in the action sometimes, and honestly does a great job of making you feel more responsible for what's going on in cutscenes, as opposed to you just miraculously being defeated like a cutscene, as is a trope in video games. From there, let's talk about combat. Combat saw a pretty substantial overhaul. Now, a lot of this is down to the classes and their changes. Again, they all feel much more distinct. They have more abilities. However, this also saw a pretty important update as well. So rather than just shoot at enemies till they're dead now, there is a sort of rock, paper, scissors system with armor, shields, and barriers. Enemies can have armor, shields, or barriers. You yourself will usually have your health and a shield of some sort, but certain weapon types that are available to you based on your class will be more effective at attacking certain types of barrier, armor, shield, etc. For instance, heavy pistols are great against armor. Other weapon types are more effective against a barrier, which just right there leads to a lot of weapon switching and kind of understanding what you're hitting and why you're not doing the most amount of damage possible. This combined with weapon abilities that will see you adding effects to your bullets, like incendiary ammo, that type of stuff, that makes it just a more robust experience. Now, I would tell you the cover part of this primarily cover shooter style game is still a bit wonky. So in the first game, you would just run up to cover and it would automatically shove you into cover. Now they've relegated that to a button, but it's the same button that is whatever you're trying to do when you're sprinting, which can lead to a lot of the same problems. Now, thankfully, due to some key bindings, you can change this, but the initial experience is nonetheless strangely similar. But in terms of combat difficulty, there are a wide range of options. Now, I played my first run through on Insanity. This can be made a bit easier if you are importing a character, or if it's your second or third or fourth or whatever game. Because importing a character sees you get a lot of extra experience and credits, etc., which will help you out. And then on a subsequent playthrough, you actually get further bonuses in terms of more credits as well as extra experience earned throughout the game. But I would tell you, Insanity with my imported character was relatively easy. There were a handful of fights that gave me a lot of trouble. And while I would tell you Insanity is a lot more difficult in Mass Effect 2 than it is in Mass Effect 1, it still was not that great of a challenge. You just have to pay attention to what you're shooting at in terms of shield, barrier, armor, etc., and have a solid understanding of the cover system, and as long as you've got that down, Insanity wasn't that bad. But there were a handful of fights that were quite frustrating. But you compare that to, I believe it's their casual mode, and you can kill just about everything in a couple hits without even really ducking into cover all that much. So there's some options there. Now, let's talk companions. So we go from 6 companions in the first game to 12 in Mass Effect 2. So I'm not going to talk about every single one of these guys in depth, would be here for another 30-40 minutes. But what I did decide to do is, after I'm done reviewing all 3 of the main trilogy, in addition to a story video kind of talking about the series, I'm going to make a companions video where I talk about each of them more in depth and kind of rank them for fun. But broadly speaking, in addition to the 12 companions you actually get, you will also see any of your old companions that survived your previous playthrough if you imported it, or depending on your decisions in the interactive comic if you chose to do that. Now, I will tell you, it was really cool seeing the previous companions and kind of what they've been up to since the events of the first game and the 2 years that followed your death. That was actually a really rewarding thing to see, just kind of what those companions did afterwards and how they reacted to you being apparently dead. But the companions themselves are a huge part of Mass Effect 2. Each of them has an introductory mission, they have a bunch of dialogue on the ship in between missions they can talk to you about, and all of them have a big loyalty mission, which is like their big side quest. And in some cases, you can fail this and not earn that character's loyalty, which will then have ramifications on the final mission, especially if they are assigned to do something for you. But a lot of the storytelling revolves around these companions and your interactions with them and your ability to lead. So you can't really understate the importance of the companions to Mass Effect 2. They are integral to the main story. And naturally, as a result of that, depending on whether you're playing male shep or fem shep, there are a bunch of romance options. They include romances with companions that carried over from the first game. Even though some of those characters aren't companions in the second game, you can still meet up with them and then usually continue those relationships if you want. You can form new relationships with the new companions. There are even side romances, which are really more like one-night stands that you can also take part in if you fulfill certain criteria. So there's a lot of that if you're into it. But I would tell you, broadly speaking, the companions are more interesting than the first iteration of them, and this is primarily because you see a lot more of expanded lore and different takes on the alien companions and what they're doing. And I would tell you, my opinion from the first game hasn't much changed in that the human companions tend to be a little more boring compared to the alien companions, because contrary to popular belief, I am in fact a human being, which means human being companion stories are relatively familiar, if you will, whereas the stuff going on with the aliens I think is more interesting by default. That said, I would tell you this game did do a much better job with the human companions. Even the ones that are a little boring themselves usually have a really interesting loyalty mission, which can help make up for it. Now, last up, I want to talk a little bit about the 3 major DLCs. Now, the Legendary Edition includes all the DLC, of which there were many minor ones, but there are, I would say, 3 large ones: Overlord, Arrival, and Lair of the Shadow Broker. So, Overlord was really awesome. It talked about Cerberus's depravity, basically, things they get up to. Cerberus is a terrorist organization by all rights. So naturally, in their drive to put humanity first above everyone else, that leads to some pretty messed up stuff, and Overlord really highlights that. Then we have Lair of the Shadow Broker, which I loved. I think Lair of the Shadow Broker did such a great job of expanding Liara, who was a companion from the first game. In that review for the first game, I actually talked about how I thought she was kind of boring, even though she was an alien race. Lair of the Shadow Broker kind of takes that way farther, and you really see the development of her character in that DLC, and I'm really glad that I finally got to see her kind of expand and grow up in some ways. And then there is Arrival. Arrival is probably the most important, as it is not exactly tied to the story of Mass Effect 2, but it has implications with the Reapers and their attempts to use one of the mass relays to start their invasion. Now, it's my understanding that if you don't complete this DLC, then in Mass Effect 3, it said that some contingent of human military did it instead. But Arrival, I don't really want to spoil it at all, but it was pretty cool. It dealt with indoctrination a lot, which we'd heard about a decent amount up to this point, which is the process by which the Reapers basically just mind control people while slowly killing them, and the effects that that can have. Overall, though, pretty good DLC, and I liked it. But let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, we have the improved combat, which I think really helped the game out. We have the companions, which are really, really a great cast of characters that I think were handled really well and expanded the universe. And then we actually have the choices and consequences. So not only do we get to see the results of some of our previous decisions, everything we do in this game culminates in that final mission, which then plays out largely based on the decisions we made up to that point, even if you realize it or not. And I thought that was a really cool way to handle this, and I can see why this game is so beloved just as a result of that alone. Now, in terms of the negatives, I would say the lack of exploration was a bit of a bummer. Again, personally, I would have seen them make the exploration meaningful instead of really empty like the first game, but clearly that's not the direction they wanted to go in. On top of that, the progression got gutted. There's just a very clear line of progression for everything. It's very hands-off. Just playing the game will basically get you there in most cases. Almost nothing in terms of items. Everything's down to either research or just the couple of extra different weapons you get, and that's basically it for progression. And then there are the sort of soft timers. Now, you can actually do everything in Mass Effect 2, but there are a couple of small timers in the game. There's only, I believe, 2 of them that really matter. but the game doesn't really warn you about them. And if you know about them, you very clearly know when you can go explore and do everything you want to do. But if you're just playing along and you don't know about them, it can kind of ruin that experience for the first time at least. Now let's talk conclusion. Overall, despite a few negatives, a fantastic experience. There was a very clear shift in direction, but truth be told, I think they're a little better off for it. Mass Effect 1 tried to do two different things. They wanted this more action-oriented story, while also holding on to a very light smattering of RPG mechanics, whereas Mass Effect 2 was just like, let's go the action game route. And as a result of that focused direction, I think it winds up being a better game with better stories to tell. And while, as someone who loves RPGs and CRPGs, etc., obviously I'm a little biased here, but nonetheless, even in spite of that, I can see why they made the choices they made. And I think Mass Effect 2 really benefits from that, again, focused direction that they picked with this title. It's a game that doesn't try to do too much. It seems to know exactly what it wants to do, and it does it well. However, for the next title, I've heard that things go a little sideways. I've heard some bad things about Mass Effect 3. Haven't played it yet. Don't spoil it for me. But I can see why Mass Effect 2 is such a big deal to people, because this was honestly a fantastic experience. Now, the Legendary Edition you can find on sale all the time. I picked it up for like $20 myself. I believe they were giving it away free in the month of July on Prime Gaming, if I'm not mistaken. So that might be something you want to look into. But great game, great experience. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Stick around for the Mass Effect 3 review, as well as the videos about the series and the companions to follow. But regardless of all that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.